Hello, and welcome to EPR with your favorite environmental nerds, Nic and Laura. On today's episode, Nic and I talk about delivering bad news. We catch up with Mike Leahy about the National Wildlife Federation, wildlife conservation, and monarch butterflies. And finally, monarch butterflies are known for their long migrations across the U.S., but did you know that they're also poisonous to predators? They store toxins from the milkweeds that they eat as caterpillars. And there, I thought there would be something more.
Oh, they just eat milkweed and get toxic, like we all do, honestly.
Right. I wonder if there's something eating them, getting like drunk off of them.
Probably.
Yes, we need more information. And as a side note, the chrysalis of a monarch butterfly has gold studs. I've seen this before.
Really? I've never seen it. I thought that was standard.
I think I've seen it, but that is pretty cool. Hit that music.
The Florida Association of Environmental Professionals 2025 annual conference will occur at the Hilton St. Petersburg Bayfront Hotel from March 12th to 14th in, you guessed it, St. Petersburg, Florida. NAEP will host an advanced NEPA workshop on March 12th that will focus on the changes in the upcoming administration. So it's really cool to have that collaboration between both groups. And the very cool Environmental Professionals podcast is also going to be hosting an event on the 14th. How about that? So all the more reason to go. Please check it out at www.faep-fl.org. Looking for a great sponsor opportunity? 60% of listeners have bought something from a podcast ad, and we are a top 5% podcast in the world. That's pretty cool. If you'd like to sponsor the show, please head on over to www.environmentalprofessionalsradio.com and check out the sponsor form for details. We will appreciate you immensely as you keep the show growing. I know, Laura, you had a topic in mind for our talk together. Sam had one as well, which I thought was pretty cool.
Which is what?
Delivering bad news is what I would say. Something like along those lines, maybe. But like if you're like nervous or shy or upset or scared or whatever it is, but just delivering something that you think is bad, and like when to do it, how to do it, tips and tricks for doing that kind of thing.
Ooh, that, you know what? Yes, please. So I think for me, that's one of those things where it's like, if you could go back and do something different, there's so many times I would have spoke up before I did or never did.
Right. Yeah. And that's actually like the first thing I thought of, right? Because I remember one of the big things for me in my early career was I took a job in DC, but was, really wanting to live in North Carolina. I didn't want to live in DC. It's expensive. I couldn't afford anything. I needed to leave. And I wasn't quite shy about that, but I was afraid to ask. I mean, I was genuinely afraid to ask. And it took me a couple of months. Like I got sent on a temporary assignment. I was like, I'll ask after that. And I got back. I had to catch up. And I'm like making all these excuses for not having the conversation, right? But the main reason I didn't want to is because I was afraid they would fire me, right? For saying I wanted to move. And then I told my boss and he said, and I quote, "Oh, I thought you'd ask me sooner than this. All right. Yeah, sure. No big deal. We've got an office in Raleigh. You'll be fine." And I had built up this monster in my head. I had thought this conversation would go so poorly and I would have to argue my way through it. And I'd have to have all these counterpoints to everything. And I really had thought of every way the conversation could go. Welcome to anxiety, friends. Yeah, I didn't need any of that because my perception was completely wrong. And then I was like, why didn't I do this 6 months ago? I could have been there 6 months earlier. Not that it would have changed a ton, but it would have made my personal life a lot easier, a lot better. And so my first piece of advice is just do it. When you have bad news that you need to give, there's no sense in waiting. You do not need to wait. Don't be shy about it. Just deliver. It may not be as bad as you think. And even if it is, bad news does not get better with time.
Right. And I think too, yes, do it, but consider time and place. You want to do it at lunch with a bunch of other people or something. But if you can get time, and sometimes it can be challenging to get the time or space that you need to do it. But then at some point it becomes an email. We need to talk. It doesn't mean you tell them what it is. It's just, we need to talk. And I, my Gen X brain always relates back to movies for all of the life advice in my head. So for me, this always goes back to reflecting on Home Alone and Kevin when he is with the old neighbor next door who has a bad relationship with his daughter. And he's afraid to call her because what if she doesn't want to talk to him? Yeah. And then Kevin just says, well, what if she does? At least you'll know.
Yeah.
At least you'll know. Like, get it over with, you know?
Yeah. At least you'll know is really, it's really good. I think it's a brilliant way to put it, because I think the unknown ends up becoming worse than the actual outcome, right? Almost every time. And even if the outcome is bad, that's not a place you want to work with. If you have news to deliver and their response is you're fired, and you're like, okay, unless it's like genuinely a crime or you've done something truly egregious, that's not a place you want to work.
Exactly. I think that's the flip side. If they aren't caring enough, like your boss was like, yeah, whatever, I get it. You know, if they aren't caring enough to get it or empathize with you or work with you, then do you even want to be there? Yeah. And of course, we all need jobs, we got bills to pay and whatever. But at the same time, sometimes the universe pushes us in ways that we need to be pushed.
Exactly. And like, it's one of those things where like empathy and kindness don't have to be like the only thing, but they're really important. And discovering that about your employer or your direct bosses is great. I know as someone who's dealing with boss that's deeply unempathetic and how difficult that's been for them. It's tough. And, my solution, like asking for advice was, is this really a place you want to be? If you're not in a place where you, as a person who needs, and this is somebody who really needs empathy, if you need that and you're not getting it, then you need to leave. You know the writing on the wall. This person's not going anywhere. Why wait? Why waste time?
Yeah. But I think this too, if I'm thinking about the answer to this question, how do you do it? Okay, I know I need to, I know I have to, I should do it, all of that, great, whatever. But what do I do? I don't know if there's an actual term for this, but someone taught me this, where you have a conversation where you kind of influence the outcome, right? So the way to do that is to approach the person and say something vulnerable. So I know that we haven't talked a lot. I know that I'm not maybe the best employee. I know that whatever. And Chris Voss talks about this too in Never Split the Difference, which is a negotiation tactic book, where you would say everything bad about yourself you think the other person is going to say before they say it. So I'd be like, Nick, right. I know you're going to think I'm a total jerk. I know you're going to think I'm a flake. You're going to think I'm stupid, but I have to tell you about something I did or a problem I'm having or whatever. And then you say, I know we both want to get this project finished. So then the next thing you move into is what your shared goal and outreach is. Like, we both want to see a successful thing happen here. How do we make it happen together? And then tell them what the problem is.
That's great. Yeah. I mean, that's like how I got through high school, I'm pretty sure. Nobody ever bullied me because I was just better at it, better at bullying myself. And so it's kind of like that, honestly.
Yeah. So you can bully yourself and then say, and then if you really want to make it work, flatter the hell out of the person. Nick, I know you're really good at solving these problems. Put it on, make them you're so great at this. I know you can help me with this. Mm-hmm. And then they're like, oh, dang, now I got to help you. What is it? What's the problem? I want to know.
It does depend, right, on who it is. And sometimes, like someone like me, if flattery is the way to my heart, that is true. You're so smart. Oh, really? Okay, what else do you want to know? Oh, yeah, whatever you said. I didn't hear you after you said I was great. I'm only half kidding, but everybody's a different personality, different style too. And that's something I think it's harder to pick up on when you're younger, but trying to pay attention to what your boss, gravitates towards, pay attention to what they like, what they don't like, how they respond to other people, not just you. And that can help you kind of frame out how you want to approach it. Right.
If your boss really loves Oreos, bring a box of Oreos. Listen, boss, I got some bad news. Have some cookies.
Yeah. And I think, honestly, that's one of the pieces of advice I got from someone on the C-suite at my previous company. And we're talking, 10, 15,000 employees. And, we were asking advice on careers. And he said, the biggest mistake I ever made was not being honest about a mistake I had made. And it ended up, he's like, it cost me career advancement. It really derailed my career for a few years because I wasn't able to just tell bad news. And the only reason I didn't was because I was worried and I was scared. And it ended up being way worse because I didn't say anything. And that stuck with me.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I mean, number one, just do it. But you can use these other little things to ease the pain.
Yeah, very cool. All right, that's a good place to stop. So why don't we go ahead and get to our interview?
Do it. Welcome back to EPR. Today we have Mike Leahy with us. Mike is the Senior Director of Wildlife Policy for the National Wildlife Federation. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you, Laura.
Awesome. We are excited to have you. So the National Wildlife Federation is one of those careers that a lot of people graduate from and want to take a shot at. And then they come to me for career coaching because they get kind of depressed that they haven't gotten a foot in the door. So could you tell us a little bit about how you got your start there and what led you to it?
Oh, sure. I have always, like other people, wanted to work for the National Wildlife Federation. Somewhat unexpectedly made a whole career in the nonprofit world and worked for a number of different groups, but I am particularly interested in wildlife conservation. And so was always really interested in National Wildlife Federation. And it was through contacts I had made throughout my career that worked at the National Wildlife Federation that it came to pass. And I was working for another organization and they reached out to me for some advice on an open position and then inquired if I was interested. And it turns out I was. So, I think the nonprofit world is pretty good about welcoming people in and looking out for people within the nonprofit world. We always need new blood, but I found that there's, a lot of people looking out for each other in the nonprofit world. And that's how it worked out for me.
That's awesome. Can you talk about that a little bit more? I think for some people, especially a lot of kids now who graduated college, they may not have even gone to in-person classes. So that for them, just saying like, oh, I met some people and then they gave me some recommendations is foreign. So what does actually meeting people and, making those connections look like in real life?
I have been really shocked would be an appropriate word at the extent to which these people I have met and developed relationships through in the early part of my career and throughout my career have carried forward, and I still have relationships with them, and how important and meaningful that is. I think it's really unfortunate for a lot of younger people who came up during the COVID and the pandemic and, haven't had all these interactions. I think that's fine. I don't think it is that much of a barrier or deterrent, but I, had, in my early part of my career, worked with all these people and they're still around and we're still interacting and engaging and communicating with each other and providing each other advice. So it's been really important to me, more so than I would have thought. I honestly, early in my career, didn't really think that much of it. And then
right.
It's panned out in an important way.
Do you find that that you have to be the person to do the reaching out to maintain those relationships, or is it kind of two ways?
Personally, I have to do the reaching out. I have some hermit-like qualities to my personality. So I need to be proactive. I think for other people, it comes a little more naturally and, they're out and about and running into people all the time. And I do a lot of that too, of course, but I was not intentional about it to my detriment. And I have learned that I need to be intentional about it.
That's good. I like the word intentional. And has there been anybody in particular that was really helpful in helping you get in the foot in the door? Anybody want to shout out?
Oh, my first supervisor at the National Audubon Society was a guy named Brock Evans, and he has since retired and moved out to Washington State, but he was a former Marine who was a lawyer in the Pacific Northwest, who got really interested in the fate of the old growth forests there and ended up working for a number of groups and became kind of iconic within the forest conservation space, which was a huge deal back in the 80s and 90s. It's still a big deal, but it was an even bigger deal back then. And I had a pretty eclectic background in my 20s of, I studied natural resources, policy and management. And then I went off and just kind of rumbled around for a couple of years and did odd natural resource related and field jobs and something in that background related to him. And so he hired me on as an intern. And then he was in the process of moving out or being moved out of the National Audubon Society. So he kind of set me up to carry forward a lot of his work. And then he was always, even after he left the National Audubon Society, he was always around as a sounding board and always provided me great advice and insight and served as a reference. So there have been a lot of people, of course, but he really stands out as someone who made a significant and direct impact on my career.
That's awesome. And then how long have you been at the National Wildlife Foundation?
Federation, actually. They're
Federation.
a similarly named organization, but we're the National
Right.
Federation. And
Federation.
I have been here a little over 9 years.
Fantastic. And so has your role changed much over the years? How did you start and where are you now?
My role has changed a lot. I started out working on public lands and about 10 to 15% of my time on hunting and fishing issues. I focused mostly on public lands for a couple of years, and then I transitioned into the wildlife policy space, which was vacant and, had a lot of overlap. And now I am mostly wildlife conservation and hunting and fishing policy.
Oh, wow. So what is that like a day-to-day life? Like, are you talking to people about how to enact policy? Are you reviewing policy? Are you developing policy? What's the day-to-day job?
It's all of the above. Some of it is direct outreach to members of Congress and their staff on legislation, pro or con. Some of it is direct outreach to administration staff and the agencies and with the White House recommending regulations or recommending against regulations or advising them on implementation. A whole lot of it is internal coordination within the National Wildlife Federation, and we have 52 state and territorial affiliates. We have basically a primary partner in each state and most territories, and so we coordinate with them on our priorities and their priorities and try to get all on the same page. And then there's a lot of coordination with other nonprofit organizations and groups in this conservation space. And NWF, we consider ourselves a Big Tent organization. We cross the spectrum from hunters and anglers to gardeners to environmentalists to wildlife advocates. So, and we work with organizations in all those spaces. So we try to coordinate with them. That's where a lot of the power lies, when you have a good base of support for whatever bill you're pushing.
Yeah.
And so it's nonprofit groups, it's state agencies, it's tribes. So just trying to get as many people as you can on the same page and in agreement on something, and then you have a good basis for making a pitch to an administration or to Congress.
Yeah, and that's a great point, because I think that's one of those things that the people that you mentioned all have different wants, needs, and interests that overlap sometimes. And preservation of hunting ground, for example, can preserve habitat and things like that. So when you have a change in administration like we have now, is that something do you have to work a little bit harder? Is that something that depends on what your interests are at the time? Or is it kind of like we've done the transition a couple of times in the past 4 years, past few years, I mean. Is it just kind of rolling with what comes, or do you plan ahead a little bit?
You plan ahead as best you can. There are always major shifts, or almost always major shifts with new administrations. And we've had some pretty significant swings with the last number of administrations. But in every administration, there have been good conservation achievements and a lot of things that we've been able to get done and our partners have been able to get done. You have to kind of figure out what the focal areas are and where you can make some progress. And so you always need to shift and readjust. And then you got to build relationships with people hired into that administration. Hopefully you already have some, or some of your colleagues do, but there's always some starting from scratch. We're often trying to make a pitch to carry over some good programs from one administration to the next. And we have varying success with that. But just by way of example, the first Trump administration initiated a very popular program, a Western Big Game Secretarial Order, focused on maintaining migrations in the West for pronghorn antelope and for elk and for mule deer. And the Biden administration carried that program forward and expanded it. And we're hoping to carry it forward yet again in the second Trump administration here.
Yeah. And you've worked on projects kind of like wildlife crossing pilot programs and stuff like that as well. When those things happen, can you kind of give us, actually that one is a pretty good one to talk about. So the wildlife crossing pilot program, how did that come to be? And, why is that important to you? And where is it now?
That is the product of decades of work on the ground on connecting wildlife across roads and highways, in particular, underpasses, overpasses, fencing. And that work gradually built up steam and momentum. And so I got pulled into that a little bit in the late 90s, quite a bit in the early 2000s. It was like pulling teeth to get anybody, even nonprofit environmental groups and wildlife groups, to focus on it and work on it. But there were an increasing number of professionals and biologists and transportation people on the ground who were doing these projects. Some of the tribes played a real leadership role in this and showing what was possible and how it could be done, and insisting on wildlife permeability across highways through the reservation. The Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribe on the Flathead Reservation of Montana is pretty famous for their work there. There were good international examples. So when this idea came up to have a nationwide program with dedicated funding, honestly, it was the easiest thing I have ever worked on in my career. That was, around 2018 to 20. I think it was officially signed into law in 21. But by that point, the issue had all this momentum. Everybody was on board. Within the nonprofit groups, you had everybody from the hunting groups to the animal welfare groups and everybody in between saying, this is a great idea. And in general agreement, there were some minor differences around the amount of money and stuff like that. But
right.
all these groups, Democrats, Republicans, state agencies, tribes, everybody supported it. So it came up in Congress and pretty much sailed through. There were some hiccups and we had to do some things, make sure it happened. But on the whole, it was pretty easy and a fun thing to work on. That we ended up getting a comprehensive program, but the core of it was $350 million of dedicated money for wildlife crossings and over 5 years. And 4 years of that have been allocated, and there's one more round of funding to go. And then we're in the process of trying to reauthorize that program, get some more funding for it, and try to make it permanent as part of the upcoming highway/infrastructure bill.
Gotcha.
That's awesome.
So when you win something like that, when something like that finalizes, is it like you have to throw a party? Like you're like, oh, we did it. It sounds like you're like, well, that's great. Let's keep going, which is really cool too. So do you allow yourself to kind of celebrate a victory like that?
Yeah, there's always a happy hour of some sort or multiple happy hours.
Right.
But I find, you invest time and energy into something like that and you get so backed up on your other priorities
right.
that, you kind of got to get right back to them and catch up on those other things you've been working on, like wildlife disease or something we were working on. And so, I had to catch up there and try to make some progress on that issue, which is a less compelling issue. The wildlife corridors are super visual and people understand them and love them. And then, figuring out how to address wildlife diseases it's important, but not as exciting and, a little harder.
Well, it's funny. Like I worked in my grad school work, I worked with a vet who was working on chronic wasting disease with deer in Virginia, actually. And one of the things we were talking about together was, well, he's like, this can be a problem, especially with people who are bringing deer all in one place, like feeding them. So if one deer has it, they all get it. And then, no one has anything to hunt, but it's easier to hunt if you bring feed to a spot. And so all these really neat little nuances for that. And I don't know, can you kind of maybe, to me, that's very interesting. I think that's kind of neat to see that, like you talk about wildlife disease, like some of the practical side of like why people should care about managing wildlife disease.
Well, it's interesting you bring up chronic wasting disease because that was the very issue that we needed to catch back up on. We had been working on it all the way through, of course, but we had some work to do there. And so a number of bills have passed in Congress in the past 6 or 7 years to address chronic wasting disease. But, again, it took a few years to get those up and running. And the first couple bills that passed were focused on federal agencies and research. So important components. But we had been working on a bill for a number of years and convened a bunch of partners to craft this bill, focus on getting states and tribes the resources they need to address chronic wasting disease, because they're really on the front lines of that. And, the first to notice it and have to deal with it. And so federal coordination is really helpful and important, but a lot of the burden falls on states and tribes. And it took 5 or 6 years to get that bill over the finish line. And we ended up, we were talking about who you work with in this space. One of the things that helped us get that over the line, maybe the key thing, was the hunting groups partnering with the deer breeders who have, they keep deer within fenced in areas for people to come and hunt. Sometimes these are big fenced areas, sometimes they're not as big, but there's tension between those two parties a lot of times, but it was those groups coming together saying we had this shared concern about the impact of chronic wasting disease on wild deer and on captive deer. And so, the important thing is to get some legislation and some funding going in this space. And, if these diseases, as far as the impacts go, they get out into deer populations, they spread, it's always fatal for deer. It's really sad to see deer that have this disease. They stumble, it takes them years usually to pass away. And by the end, they're kind of stumbling around. And it's the equivalent of mad cow disease for deer, Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease in humans. These are all the similar sort of disease. And, it has a impact on those individual deer, of course, but it's having in places like Colorado and Wisconsin, where it's really spread, it's having population level impacts. It can be a deterrent to hunting because hunters, can get concerned about going out and shooting and eating these deer, and their family members may not want to eat them. And then that affects the funding of hunters and their license fees, and tax dollars provide a lot of funding for conservation of all wildlife. So it affects the conservation funding mechanism. So that's just one example of these trickle-down effects.
Oh, yeah. And it's just a great example, too, because you just start going and you can start rattling off all these things that people really do care about and do appreciate, and that's one of the wonderful things about the industry in general. But we also like talking about policy specifically. And we haven't talked a lot about the Endangered Species Act, to be honest. But we haven't talked a ton about it. So it's definitely one of those foundational conservation laws. Like we have, for what I do, we end up using it as, Section 7 consultation. We say, hey, we have a project. Here are the species that are in there. This is what could be impacted. Here are our best management practices to avoid those impacts, such and so on and so forth. But on a whole, like, what about the Endangered Species Act? Why is that so crucial for wildlife protection?
The Endangered Species Act is the backstop. If species need to be listed as threatened or endangered, the other systems have failed, right? We have all these mechanisms in the U.S. for maintaining and managing wildlife, and states have a primary role for a lot of species generally within the state, and they're supposed to maintain all of those species and populations and the public trust for all Americans. And then tribes have jurisdiction and do really important management of wildlife and habitats on reservation, but they also have a lot of interests and responsibilities off reservation. But, for a lot of species, that all doesn't necessarily work. And they get to a point where they need to be listed as threatened or endangered. And it's an important backstop, and you bring federal resources and federal coordination and a lot of new tools and protections. So it's proven really important. And nearly all the species on the list are still around. There are 50 some odd, I think, have gone extinct, but most of them are still around. And that's because of the Endangered Species Act. That's also because of the continued interest of a lot of states and tribes and private landowners and others. But basically, the Endangered Species Act says, all right, no more. We're going to draw a line here and try to stop the decline in this species and reverse it. Unfortunately, it has become controversial. And so that's one of my career priorities, is to try and deconflict the ESA to make it just part of the overall wildlife management process in the United States. If a species gets in trouble, it needs to go on the list. If it does better, it can come off the list. So we have problems in both directions, where we have organizations and people and industries and conservationists even trying to keep species off of the list, not for the benefit of the species, but because they're concerned about regulations and restrictions. But then we have groups that really try to keep species on the endangered species list longer than it needs to be, because they don't want to see it hunted or whatever the case may be, or they're worried what's going to happen in state management. And so it creates these tensions and controversies. So we're always trying to work through those.
So that is all fascinating, the way that we have this policy for so long, and it's kind of evolved into maybe a little bit what it was intended for, and then also people trying to use it for other reasons. But out of all these different groups and the Wildlife Federation, who puts the animals on the list? Who's the one, or the plants or whatever, who says, I think we should list this? And then what is the Wildlife Federation's role in saying yes or no, or grabbing the research, or how does it all come together?
The two entities that put species on the list. The primary one is the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, and they are responsible for the terrestrial species and some aquatic and marine species. NOAA Fisheries, which is in the Department of Commerce, and it is National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Fisheries Division, is responsible for a subset of those species, marine species, and some anadromous species. So they have jurisdiction, and they make the determination as far as which species need to go on and off the list. They can do that on their own, but the Endangered Species Act is unique in that there's a petitioning mechanism. So any individual or organization can petition to have a species listed or delisted, and generally you're going to want to provide as much science as you can as far as why the species needs to be listed. And then the agencies make a determination as far as whether or not there's enough information to go forward. They make an initial finding, and then if there's enough information to go forward, they make an actual finding a little while down the road. So it's the two agencies ultimately that do that, but there can be a lot of input from outside the agencies.
Okay, great. And then if I make a claim and try to list something or delist and it doesn't happen, is there like a waiting period? Do I have to try again later? Or is it a yes or no kind of a thing?
There are some deadlines, and the agencies are supposed to make a decision, an initial determination within 90 days. And then they're supposed to make, if they're going to go forward, they're supposed to make a more formal proposal after 12 months. But those are tight deadlines, and the agencies are understaffed and underfunded. And even with the best of intentions, they can't always or even often meet those deadlines. So you can bring litigation to try to force them to meet those deadlines. But, I think even the most ardent wildlife and conservation and environmental groups recognize that those deadlines in a lot of cases are unrealistic. So, they might not be knocking down the door as soon as those deadlines have passed. But, if some more time goes by and no action is taken, you can bring litigation to try to force a decision.
All right. It's good information. And if you're listening and you're looking for careers and want to work with endangered or any type of wildlife, all of the different organizations that Mike just mentioned are ones you could look into. And Mike, you've been working with Monarch Butterflies too? Is that part of the Endangered Species Act?
It was recently proposed to be listed as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act.
Yeah. So walk us through that process. Because I know, like for me, like growing up as a kid in Virginia, I used to see monarchs all the time. Like I used to see, that was just like a thing that happened. And, over time you kind of start to notice, oh, I haven't seen them in a while. I haven't even thought about it. Like, oh yeah, there's less of them. So I feel like that's a species almost exclusively that people have been talking about for a while. So how is it getting to the proposed stage? Was it research that was done? Because I feel like we've been talking about it for a very long time, but it's just now started to get into that process that we talked about earlier.
There is a lot of attention on the monarch butterfly, which created the scientific basis for this recommendation to list it as threatened. So the monarch is one of the flagship species for the National Wildlife Federation. And we have all these programs and people working on pollinators in general, gardening for wildlife, supporting monarchs and monarch habitat as part of that, encouraging people to plant milkweeds and nectar plants that the monarchs need. So it's a unique species in that it is one that so many of us remember growing up, and, you'd be out in the yard playing and this beautiful butterfly would flitter by and you'd, gawk at it. Yeah. It was really cool, right? And there were a lot more of them.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people have had that experience. It's also unique in that almost all of us can participate in its recovery because their range encompasses most of the continental U.S. and planting milkweeds, native milkweeds, not tropical milkweeds, which are sometimes wrongly promoted as helpful, but native milkweeds in your yard or nectar plants can contribute to their recovery. But we've learned it's more than that. The increasing commercialization of agriculture has removed a lot of their milkweed habitat. And, we haven't been able to fully offset that yet. Climate change is an increasing factor, challenging their recovery. So the Fish and Wildlife Service has proposed to list them as threatened. And, we're supporting that proposal. And we're hoping, again, that this is not that controversial. There's always going to be controversy, right? And there's going to be, individuals and industries that are concerned about the impacts on their livelihood. But, this is such a popular species, and there's so many actions that can be taken to recover it. And the main one is that they need more milkweed habitat throughout their flyways in particular. And so, there's a real recovery potential here. So, we're hoping that listing continues and that the proposal is finalized and they are listed as threatened. And then we can have, get more serious about actually recovering them and then getting them off of the endangered species list.
Yeah, which is really, really neat. And it's interesting is like, I think one of the other species we've talked about, and so like it's almost a completely opposite of monarch butterfly, but the red wolves in North Carolina was a program that was working. Then there were challenges and was not working. And it's kind of in a strange place. So what I'm trying to say is I appreciate the work that you are doing because it is not easy. And it is very hard to maintain something, even if it's working. So I appreciate the effort there because I know that's pretty challenging. So we've got all these laws, like you say, like ESA is the backbone, right? There are others as well. There's the Marine Mammal Protection Act, there's Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, the Migratory Bird, and then Recovering America's Wildlife Act. So how do these all kind of work together? Are there other things that you work on besides endangered species? Do you also working with getting species on the migratory bird list, or just kind of keeping that updated and maintained? And how is it kind of different than working with species on ESA?
So we work in one way or another on all of these laws as they relate to wildlife. So the Migratory Bird Treaty Act is a good example. We were talking about partnering earlier.
Yeah.
And the National Wildlife Federation, our members, we have a huge interest in birds and bird conservation. But we really partner with the National Audubon Society, for example, on that law, and the American Bird Conservancy, and groups that are really focused on birds. And so they, in a lot of cases, will take the lead and we'll work with them and support them just because we don't have enough resources to go around and, play a leadership role on all these issues. So there's some real partnering on some of these issues. Same with Marine Mammal Protection Act. Our top priority, however, is this Recovering America's Wildlife Act that you mentioned. That's an area where the National Wildlife Federation plays a leadership role. And what that law does is it gets states and tribes and, to a lesser extent, federal agencies the resources that they need to maintain species, to keep them from becoming threatened and endangered, to keep them off the endangered species list. So it provides upstream funding and guidance for upstream collaborative solutions to a lot of these problems. And so the idea is if you can nip it in the bud, it's better for the species, it's less controversial. So this law is wildly popular. The problem is it costs money. So we've been trying to figure out the financial side of that for a number of years. And we are working on that again this Congress. But, pretty much everyone agrees, or most everyone agrees with the premise of the law that states need more funding for species that aren't hunted and fished in particular. So, the state funding model is founded on hunters and anglers and their license fees and their tax dollars that I mentioned earlier. And those go into, a lot of that goes into the state agencies who then spend it on conservation of all species. But naturally, a lot of that money goes to the species that are hunted and fished and keeping those populations up so that they're healthy and there can be good hunting and fishing experiences. But, the states have this jurisdiction over a lot more species and want funding to manage them. They've really stepped up in recent decades saying, this is important to us and to our citizens, and we need more funding to do it. And then the tribes do incredible work on wildlife on and off reservation, as I mentioned. And I've had the experience over the years to work with some tribes and see them restore bison to reservations and recover black-footed ferret populations. And, they can just get out there and do work, and they have a lot of expertise and just do excellent work. So it provides them the first dedicated funding for their wildlife programs and wildlife projects. And then there's also some funding to help the Federal Fish and Wildlife Service with some of the more popular programs for recovering species and helping private landowners work with wildlife on their lands.
Yeah, that's very cool work. And I love it. And gosh, one of the things that, I'm actually kind of curious about, because, a lot of what you're saying doesn't sound like you do a ton of work in the field necessarily. And maybe that's true, maybe it isn't. But like one of the things we like to do on this show is ask people that come on about their stories about being in the field or doing their jobs. So it's something we call field notes. And it's part of the show where we ask you to share memorable moments of doing your job. And we encourage listeners to do the same. So if you see a hashtag field notes out in the wild, that's what it's from. But is there a memorable moment for your job? Like I say, it could be in the field. It could even be just a funny thing that happened working on all these policies. But anything that comes to mind when I ask you that question?
Two things pop to mind, and they are both field related because I spend too much of my time in front of a computer. And there have been times in my career when I had a better balance as far as getting out on the ground and working with ranchers and working with tribes and that sort of thing. But being DC focused now, a lot of my time is on the computer or in meetings and talking with people. But I was there when the first bison from Yellowstone National Park were released onto the Fort Peck Reservation. And I had just a very tiny background role in that, but the organization I worked for at the time did a lot of work to, support that and provide some funding for that. That was Defenders of Wildlife, and to help the tribes make that happen. And they did. And the National Wildlife Federation had a role in that as well. I was not here at the time, but, there was a lot of controversy over those bison in Yellowstone because some of them have brucellosis, which is a disease that can be transferred to cattle and can impact whether or not other countries are going to accept cattle from the state of Montana, for example. So again, wildlife disease issue coming into play. And it turns out cattle get brucellosis from elk. And so, bison were kind of getting a bad rap, but there were excess bison, the population in Yellowstone would grow, and then they would end up killing a bunch of bison to keep the population in check. And, the tribes were there like, we'll take some of those bison. And, those are some of the original genes, the bison genes, those Yellowstone bison were never completely extirpated, right? So it finally got approved and the tribes were able to release them. So to see those bison, coming off of that trailer and to be there for that and, see the tribal members and their kids cheering them on and singing for them and, doing a little ceremony to honor them. I mean, just super powerful.
That's amazing.
That's incredible. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
How rewarding.
And I said there'd be two. And the other one was I used to work on trying to save the last woodland caribou in the United States. And they have now completely been driven out of the continental US. But this is a very charismatic species that used to be in the northeastern US and the upper Great Lakes and the northern Rockies. And they were pushed out all those areas except for one mountain range in the far north of Idaho and Washington. And so I got to do some overflights with some of the biologists working on them. And they would be an annual flight to count the last woodland caribou. And at the time, there were basically between 38 and 48 left. And then, we were bringing some litigation to try to limit some of the impacts on them. That was all successful. But then the litigation was successful, but the caribou were extirpated anyway. So, but, being up in the plain and being able to see the landscape and see the caribou was incredible. But then it was also ultimately a sad story because they were driven out.
Yeah, man. Yeah. I mean, those are impactful moments though. Those things stick with you your whole career. And, oh my gosh. I mean, I'm mostly jealous with these stories. That's the whole reason we do them is just to make me jealous. So those are really good. Well,
I think too, it's, this is hard work to be out any role you have in the environmental field because you make 2 steps forward to take 10 backwards at times, and then how do you stay motivated to take another couple steps forward, knowing that you're going to get pushed backwards again? So, Mike, do you feel that with the projects you work on? What advice do you have for people who may be feeling that? Because I know people do.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. I don't feel that personally myself, but I totally understand why people feel that. But I feel like at every stage of my career and different jobs I've had in different politics, there have been good conservation initiatives that have moved forward and gotten achieved. Conservation overall is pretty bipartisan. And I won't say it's not controversial, but, most people believe in and support conservation and wildlife. I mean, monarch butterfly is a good example. Who doesn't like the monarch butterfly? Right. However, not everyone wants regulations on the pesticides they can put out on their crops that might impact the monarch butterfly, right? So there's a lot of really important distinctions and huge controversies that come up, but Democrat or Republican leadership in Congress or in the administration, there have always been important conservation accomplishments that have been made, and they ebb and flow, and then you see it on the ground, and There are these areas that are very seen as very toxic for wildlife, but there's still a lot of support for wildlife in those areas, but maybe not all wildlife, right? Maybe not predators, for example. So I guess I'm naturally optimistic and I see the upside and the progress, but it gives me great pain to see these, when these things don't work out, or conservationists opposing predators, for example. Like, I think we should all be supporting all of the wildlife and all the ecosystems. But, you have, even within the conservation world, you have groups and people that support some species and not others. And
right.
So I think some of those, I try to focus on like fundamental underlying principles. And so it pains me to see those get deteriorated. And Aldo Leopold, who is this, kind of a father of the conservation in America, or, an early leading intellectual thinker, would say, it's like being a biologist is to see a world of wounds, right? Everywhere he goes, you can see the wounds in the landscape. And for me, that I see that from the policy lens, right? Like all these great policies, but you see these wounds and these little cuts here and there, and you just try to hope that they don't become so big that they undermine an important principle or a law. But overall, it's positive, right? There's just so much support for this work and for wildlife and for conservation. So I always try to focus on that and find paths forward. And I know a lot of other people do as well.
Yeah. That's good. That's a good message for people to hear. Yeah. And we are running out of time. This always goes by so fast. I know that Nic and I could both talk to you about animal stories all day long. But well, let's keep with the animals though. So when we first logged on to here, you had your photo of 3 dogs. Are those your 3 babies?
Yes.
So tell us about your dogs.
One of them is a mixed breed who is mostly a collie. And I tried to make her my first hunting dog. And she's super into hunting, but she's not a hunting breed. And I learned that she liked to hunt on her own. She would love to chase a rabbit or a squirrel, but, like, didn't have any connection to me or what I was doing, right? She just off around her own. So then I acquired these are all adopted dogs, and a purebred English Springer Spaniel that turned out to have a lot of health issues and needed surgeries on her hips and stuff. But boy, she is a hunting breed and just the sweetest dog and a great nose. And so she, hunt with her and she's always looking back at you and, hey, are we going here? Are we going there? So, that's fun to like see that connection. And then my most recent dog is this little Boykin Spaniel named Grendel. And he's more of a duck dog. And he is a great hunter, but I'm learning all about training, and he's just got this big personality. He's wild. And so trying to corral all that energy into being a productive hunter, I've had a lot of challenges with that and learning how to do that. But he's getting better, but he's still not quite as focused or as controlled as I would like.
Yeah. Nothing like a headstrong dog. It is quite amusing. So I'm sure your challenges ahead of you.
But they're all great partners in the field. It's just fun to be out doing anything, just walking around and having some dog partners out there with you to keep you company. I love it.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. Like, I remember like when we adopted a dog ages ago, and she'd never worn a harness before. And she's a great dog, truly just like very people oriented, very people focused. But we put the harness on her. And so she tried to pull on her neck and she couldn't. And she looked back at me like, what'd you do to me? What is this? He's like, how dare you? And I could still see that look that she gave me. It ended up being totally fine, of course. And she was happy with it. And, but the first time still haunts me. I'm like, am I doing this wrong? Did I just keep letting her pull? And it was just such a funny thing, but like that connection is pretty important, pretty cool.
Well, last thing on dogs, at least for me, unless you have more questions, but I grew up with German Shepherds and a mixed breed. And I was really into my parents' dogs as a kid. And I envisioned I was having all these communications and interactions with them. And then I went out on my own in my 20s, and I didn't have dogs for a couple of decades. And I thought that was just all in my head. I was just a child. I was misreading that, and that was not wrong. And then I got dogs again, and I realized it was all true, right? All that communication they have with you and those interactions, it's incredible. And so I'm just kind of starting to plumb the depths of what you can expect of them and how you can train them and how you can communicate with them. But it's like way more than I envisioned as an adult, but it was everything I believed as a kid.
That's amazing.
That's great.
It is. And yeah, we can talk about this all day. So since we're kind of out of time, is there anything else that you would like to talk about that we didn't touch on?
The only last thing I would say, since this is kind of a career-oriented podcast, is when younger people, early professionals ask me for career advice, I just advise people to cast a wide net. I was kind of drawn to the nonprofit world, and these are the groups I heard about. And I had Ranger Rick as a kid, and magazine, which is what National Wildlife Federation is most known for. And I knew of the National Audubon Society. And I wanted to make positive change in the world. So I was naturally drawn to the nonprofit organizations, but I didn't pay enough attention to all the other opportunities out there. And, you can work for state agencies, you could work for federal agencies, maybe you could work for a tribe. Working on private land and with private landowners can be a great way to have a conservation impact. And businesses, a lot of businesses are working in this space, and an increasing number of them. So I just encourage people to cast a really wide net, because the area, maybe you already know exactly what you want to do, but I knew I wanted to be in this general realm and field, but I could have been a forester, or I could have been a biologist, and I ended up going to law school and becoming working in the nonprofit space. But, looking back, I should have cast a broader net. So I encourage people to do that.
Awesome. Love that. And thank you for providing that advice for people. And finally, where can people get in touch with you if they'd like to ask you some more questions?
Probably the easiest is to reach out to me at work. And my email is Leahy M at the National Wildlife Federation. So LEAHYM at nwf.org.
Awesome. Well, this has been great. Thank you so much.
You bet. Thank you guys for this opportunity. What a neat podcast, and great chance to be on it.
Yeah, thank you.
Great talking with y'all.
That's our show. Thank you, Mike, for joining us today. Please be sure to check us out each and every Friday. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. Bye.
See ya, everybody.